to be able to welcome Professor Shekhar Bandyopadhyay, Director, New Zealand India Research Institute from Victoria University of Wellington, to our research community. This talk is jointly organized by the South Asia Studies Program and by ourselves, so ISAS SASP. I'm very honored to see the director of the South Asia Study Program, Professor Vinita Sinha, amongst us. I am also very pleased that so many of you have turned up. The talk would be chaired by Dr. Ganesh Kudeshia, Associate Professor from the South Asia Studies Program. He will take us through the talk and also introduce our speaker. I would like to say a word before he does that, to give you the background of how it happened. I met Shekhar in Adelaide at a conference. As you know, conferences are like marriages. Many more new matches are made. That's where I was entirely thrown off my feet by your historian skills and your intellectual power, because you were drafted at very short notice to chair somebody else's session. And then I thought it would be nice to share you with colleagues here. And one thing leads to another. So we now have a memorandum of understanding and a very strong addition to our repertoire. But having said that, I have made it a point at ISAS, now Institute of South Asian Studies, to ask always, why are we having this talk? How does this talk connect to our work plan? After all, we work on contemporary South Asia, and we are basically a policy institute because we are funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Trade and Industry. So what is, to put it very crudely, what is the relevance of history in something as contemporary as ISAS? The reason I ask this question is because this is how I am grilled when I stand up in front of our board to justify what we do. To which my answer would be, if you're worried about the presence of history, ask yourself, what is 21st century South Asian politics about? Today, in India, in the Bihar elections, we are in a perverse situation where politicians are talking about history, and proper trained historians would like us to move on, leave history where it belongs, and look at the future as the future. So that's how history is not behind but ahead in terms of South Asian politics. And this particular talk, Shekhar has kindly said, is not just about the partition, but about the long afterlife of the partition. This is how I've said when I accepted this job. I'm a political scientist of a different kind. I said, sure, contemporary South Asia, will someone define for me when does contemporary start? Does it start in, today? Does it start at partition? Does it start with the beginning of colonial rule? Or are there traces of Kautilya in Nehru? That's how long my own understanding of time is. And in ISAS, this is how we are bringing history back in to give us a depth which policy analysis should have, in order for that policy analysis to have a second life as contribution to knowledge. These are the reasons why I was very keen to have this talk organized, and Shekhar has happily accepted our invitation. And what cheers me up even more is that the culture of conversation that Professor Prasenjit Dwara brought us at the NUS has traveled all the way to ISAS in the person of Prasenjit himself. Well done for coming, and thank you so very much, all of you. I'll hand it over now to Ganesh to take us further.
Thank you. Let me just introduce Professor Shekhar Bandyopadhyay more formally. I'm sure many of the younger colleagues here have read some of his books, which is a very important, one of his books is a very important school textbook. Professor Shekhar Bandyopadhyay's primary research is in nationalism and the question of caste in colonial and post-colonial India. Some of his recent books are Caste, Culture and Hegemony, Social Dominance in Colonial Bengal, Decolonization in South Asia, Meanings of Freedom in Post-Independence West Bengal. A second edition of his book called Caste, Protest and Identity in Colonial India, the Nam Sudras of Bengal, 1872 to 1947. And of course his very important text From Plassey to Partition and After, which has just had a new edition which has come out looking at the post-1947 period. He has been working on the history of Dalits in eastern India for quite a long time. And what we can hope this afternoon is a distillation of his reflections on this theme, which he has been engaged with for the last 3 decades or more. So with these words, over to you.
Actually, before you start, I brought along From Plassey to Partition, so that people might have a look at it, and also an advert for a new book, just called Calcutta, The Stormy Decades, co-edited with Tonika Shankar. So I'll pass it around also.
Okay, thank you very much, first of all, Professor Mitra, for inviting me to this conference, to this seminar and visit ISAS. As you said, we first met at a conference at Adelaide, and from there things started moving, and ISAS and the institute which I run, which is called the New Zealand India Research Institute, we got into a relationship, and we decided to have more activities together, and it is really a privilege on my part to be here. And also it's a pleasure always to come back to Singapore because I have been to NUS number of times. I was a visiting fellow at RE when Prasenjit gave me hospitality. That was excellent. And I was just saying the first time I came to NUS was in 1988 as a visiting fellow at ISIS when this building was not there, and Professor Sandhu was the director. That was long time ago. So I have a long association with NUS, and it is always a pleasure to come back and meet friends. So when Professor Mitra gave me this invitation to come here and talk, I thought this will be an excellent occasion to share my thoughts on my current project. And this project we started about 3 years ago. As I said, because I have an associate researcher on this project. Her name is Anusua Basurai Chowdhury, who works for Observer Research Foundation. And 2 of us started this project about 3 years ago. We have now finished our archival research as well as oral history, interviews and everything. Now we are in the process of writing the book. So I thought it will be a good opportunity to share some of the ideas, that is to give you a preview of the book that we are trying to write. And the topic of this new project or our new book is the Partition and Dalit Peasant Migration or Dalit Peasant Refugees in Eastern India between 1946 and 1964. As Professor Mitra said, that this is a topic which has not been properly looked at, and this is a topic which has very significant contemporary relevance, as some of the contemporary politics in parts of Eastern India is actually related to this continued peasant migration across what is now the India-Bangladesh border. And what we trace is the beginning of this process from around 1948, 1949, and more importantly from 1950, this migration started. So, and the other problem about this topic is that when we discuss partition, we do not talk about caste. And we never talk about, very rarely, the partition historiography would mention Dalit as a separate social category. Because partition historiography looks at this event as the result of a conflict between Muslims on the one hand, Hindus and Sikhs on the other. And all kinds of internal differentiation within these categories are collapsed. And so very little has been written on the Dalit participation in this particular social event. And this also comes, I believe, partly from the silence about or absence or invisibility of the Dalit in the relevant archives. If you look at the official archives, everything is discussed in terms of Hindus and Muslims. Even classification of dead bodies in the riots was on the basis of Hindu or Muslim. So Hindu bodies were to be cremated, Muslim bodies were to be buried. And that was the only kind of classificatory schema that the state was using. And even non-official archives, if you look at the newspaper reports, if you look at the papers of the mainstream political parties like Congress, Hindu Mahasabha, Muslim League, or Communist Party, there is hardly any mention of the word caste or Dalit. And if you look at 11 volumes of the Riot Inquiry Commission in 1946 Calcutta riot, in 11 volumes, not a single time the word caste ever appears. So there is an absolute silence or absence of this category of caste or Dalit in these archives. But recently, this particular social category has been mentioned. I must mention a few recent works starting from Urvasi Bhutalia or Ramnaran Rawat or and after Ravinder Kaur, they have mentioned that the Dalit as a social group were also affected or involved in this movement, in this particular event. But there is also a kind of assumption that since Dalit as an organized political group remained aloof from the nationalist politics led by the Congress or the Hindu Mahasabha, as they were not involved in this kind of politics, they were more kind of aloof or kind of passive onlooker when these events were unfolding. And when they became victims, they were only accidental victims, but were not deliberately targeted. Or in other words, they were standing on the periphery, not at the center of these historical events unfolding. The other problem, so far as Bengal is concerned, the Dalit peasants who lived mainly in eastern Bengal did not migrate in 1947-48, that is immediately after the partition. And since they did not migrate immediately in 1947-48, they kind of disappear from the refugee historiography or migration historiography as well. But what we propose that if we look at the long history of partition, because we argue that partition was not just an event, partition should not be looked as an event history, but rather as a long process of history. Partition had a long afterlife. And if we look at this long afterlife, then we'll find that these Dalit peasants in eastern Bengal were very significantly involved and affected in this partition politics and what happened immediately after partition. And our argument is that they were, in fact, the worst sufferers of what happened. So, as I'll come later to the conclusion that the Bengal Dalit peasants had no homeland of their own that they could call. Okay, so how do we proceed? Now, rarely in the discussion of Dalit movement, the importance of space is ever discussed. Dalit movements are almost completely discussed, explained in terms of identity, and identity coming out of their social deprivation, discrimination, and so on and so forth. But this is the map of Bengal, and this is the Radcliffe line, the bold black line. That is how Bengal was divided. And if we look at the pre-colonial history, in Bengal, historically, there were two major Dalit movements which were most powerful. But also what was significant about these movements, and which is rarely mentioned in the historiography, is that both these two movements had a very precisely defined space. The Rajbangshis in North Bengal and the Namashudras in East Bengal. And those are the blue circled areas. And if you look at how the Radcliffe line goes, the Radcliffe line divides the Rajbangshi area into two, and the entire Namashudra area goes into Eastern Bengal after the partition. So in a way, their habitational space was being very directly affected by how the Radcliffe line was being drawn. So it is not surprising that they were very, very concerned. And not only concerned, it almost completely disrupted the very powerful movement that they had organized in the 1930s and early 1940s. So by the time it comes to the mid-1940s and the partition politics starts, the partition politics almost completely disrupts and divides the whole organized Dalit movement in the Bengal region. And we find the two major divisions on the partition issue. On the one hand, there was the All India Scheduled Caste Federation, which was Dr. Ambedkar's organization. The Bengal branch, Ambedkar had founded the federation in 1942, but the Bengal branch was opened by Jogendranath Mandal in 1943. And by the time of the partition, I'm just very quickly going through these developments. By the time of the partition, the federation became pro-Muslim League. It aligned with the Muslim League and was anti-partition, and it was mainly in favor of the United Bengal movement, which was started by Sarath Chandra Bose and a part of the Muslim League around that time. On the other hand, there was a very sizable section of the depressed classes or the scheduled caste population in Bengal who organized around the depressed classes league. And their main leaders was Radhanath Das, who was a Chamar by caste, and Pramod Ranjan Thakur, who was a Namashudra by caste. And the depressed classes league was aligned with the Congress. And the depressed classes league was very much in favor of the pro-partition campaign, which the Hindu Mahasabha had started and Congress had appropriated. And this was the movement for creating a Hindu homeland in western districts of Bengal. And after 1946, and particularly from early 1947, this movement began to take momentum, particularly when Congress accepted this movement. And the depressed classes league was very much in support of the movement and created a grassroots level movement in support of it. And so, without going into details, the organized scheduled caste movement, which was very powerful, united, anti-Congress, anti-mainstream nationalist in the 1930s and early 1940s, became totally divided into two contending groups. And the major issue was either whether to ally with the Muslim League and whether to support or not partition or United Bengal. And this division was exacerbated by the Calcutta and the Noakhali riots. As I mentioned, if you look at the archives and the reports of these riots, you'll hardly find how these people were being affected. But if you look a little bit carefully and little bit closely into the accounts, you'll find that both in Calcutta and the Noakhali riots, the Namashudra peasants in Noakhali and the Chamars in the city of Calcutta were very, very actively involved in the riots, not just as victims, but also as perpetrators. So, in other words, when this the whole rioting started, the rioting was not discriminating between castes. And these other Dalit groups and organized Dalit groups were kind of actively involved in the riots, and this evidence can still be found from the archives if you read closely. But the peasant migration did not start in 1947. The first wave of migration, which happened from East Bengal to West Bengal, was mostly Bhadralok educated professionals. About 65% of them were educated professionals. So there were very few peasants or artisans among this first wave of migration. There were various reasons, and the major reasons was that, I mean, I'll come to it later on, because the federation, the Scheduled Caste Federation, advised the Namashudra peasants not to migrate because they were arguing about the best alliance and the best profitable political alliance was between the Dalit and the Muslim as being the two depressed peasant communities. And Mandal himself remained in Pakistan as the law minister, and Mandal's leadership kind of prevented the peasants from migrating at the initial stage. But the second wave of migration started from 1950, and about 2.1 million people came from East Bengal to West Bengal. And about 70% of this population, the 70% of these migrants were by caste Dalit or Namashudra peasants. And there was a third wave of migration in 1964 when about 400,000 people migrated after the Hazrat Bal riot in Khulna. The Hazrat Bal mosque was in Srinagar, where the Muhammad's relic was stolen, and a riot took place in eastern Bengal in Khulna, and there was again a large-scale migration from eastern Bengal to western Bengal. So the question is, why the Dalit peasants did not migrate in 47, 48, and why they started migrating from 1950. Now, what happens going through the public discourse around this time, both in East Bengal and Western Bengal, what we find is that what was going on around this time was a dual ascription process. And this ascription process was creating or constructing a Hindu minority identity, and this was happening in two ways. On the one hand, in East Bengal, when the Islamic nationalism was kind of gaining momentum, all the others were being lumped together as the minority. And all kinds of distinctions within this minority was being collapsed. And on the other hand, the Hindu nationalist press in Western Bengal was also kind of creating these people as constructing a Hindu minority identity. In this case, it was the beleaguered Hindu minority of East Bengal. So there's a kind of competing two kind of minority constructions was happening on the one side. On the one side, all the others of the nation was being lumped as the Hindu minority. On the other side, in West Bengal, they were being appropriated as the beleaguered Hindu minority of East Bengal, the oppressed Hindu minority of East Bengal. So all the distinctions, all the inner kind of distinctions within this community were being collapsed. And I mean, now we have Ahmed Kamal's the book, which shows even when the communist movement started in East Bengal, the communists were being identified as Hindus. So all kinds of others of the nation were being identified as Hindus. So the distinctions were being kind of disappearing. And this whole thing, even when they were Muslim. Even though, yes. So the other is the Hindu minority, and that's the kind of thing. And the whole thing started from the Khulna riot of December 1949. So what was the Khulna riot of December 49? It started from an anti-communist, anti-insurgency operation. I mean, the Tebhaga movement had reappeared in parts of eastern Bengal and central Bengal. So the Pakistani police came in search of certain communist insurgents, and this was mainly a Namashudra village, and the villagers resisted the police party. The police party initially went back, and then 2 days later, they came with more reinforcements, and the whole village now resisted the police party, and there was a violent riot. So this was essentially an anti-communist, anti-insurgency operation. But when it happened, throughout, in all Calcutta newspapers, it appeared as a communal kind of incident. Even Nehru, when he gave the statement in the Indian Parliament, it was presented as a communal incident, that the Hindu minority in Pakistan was being attacked. And this kind of triggered what is the first communal riot in Calcutta after 1947. And it is rarely recognized in the existing historiography that this Calcutta riot of 1950 triggered a huge Muslim migration from Calcutta and the surrounding areas going to Eastern Bengal. So when the Muslim refugees started going back to Eastern Bengal, it kind of triggered a widespread riot in Eastern Bengal. The riot now started in Khulna, and it spread to all other districts of Eastern Bengal. And when this riot started, the mass migration of the peasants started from January 1950. The first 500 families came, and these 500 families became kind of 5,000 to 6,000 people migrating every day. So, why this migration, which started in 1950 after a specific riot, did not stop? Why it was a continued migration which carried on until, say, 1956-57. And as I mentioned, in the peak period of this migration, about 5,000 to 6,000, even 10,000 people were coming every day. So why was this happening? Now, there are a number of reasons. I'm going very quickly. First and foremost reasons was the scarcity of resources in Eastern Bengal. First, there was the migration of the Bihari Muslims going to Eastern Bengal in the first wave. And in the second wave, Muslims working class, mainly from the Calcutta and Howrah region. I mean, the Muslim migration in Calcutta and Howrah region was so severe that some of the jute mills had to be closed because all the Muslim workers had fled. And when these people went back to Eastern Bengal, this obviously created a scarcity of resources in Eastern Bengal. And this was kind of accentuated, exacerbated by the migration of Muslims from India. And what started as a result is a competition or fight for resources. And the way it was manifested, we call it, there was no open violence. After the incidents of January, February 1950, there was no major open attack on anyone. But what we find is a routine everyday violence. Now we reconstruct these stories of routine everyday violence from when these people were coming in thousands. Calcutta police intelligence started interrogating these people. And all these interrogation reports have now been released, and they are in West Bengal State Archives, the IB reports. And what these reports, the complaints to, and which is reiterated again and again in these interrogations, is that no one really say that I was attacked. No one really can suggest any real act of violence, but there was rumors going around. But there were provocations going around. There were everyday kind of abuse going around, and it comes out very clearly. I can go into the details later on if you want to, that it was mainly to get rid of these peasants and vacate the land, which could then be taken over by the refugees coming from the other side. So it was mainly a fight for land and resources, which kind of provoked this kind of everyday violence, which began to force these people out into the western part. And then started the language movement in Eastern Bengal, and when the language movement started, the Hindu minority once again became the main suspects of the state, that they were behind this language movement. And some of these leaders of this community were actually involved in this movement as well. But then the real scare came when both Pakistan and India decided to introduce passport. When the announcement came that the passport would be introduced in October 1952, that created the real scare. That once the passport was introduced, this will close all the doors. So this was the final thing. Either immediately you leave, and if you don't leave, if the passport system comes, you will never be able to leave. So that kind of created opened the floodgates. So without going, into the details, I can in very broad terms, I can say that the reasons these people in thousands were coming in was because of an intense fight for land and resources. It was nothing to do with religion or communal conflict as such. But that was the real problem, because partition migration was regarded, or in public policy, as related to religious violence. In Government of India's rehabilitation policy, a partition refugee was one who was fleeing from religious violence from the other side. Now, these people were not fleeing from any religious violence that could be documented. So in the eyes of the Government of India, this was a completely legitimate migration. In the government parlance, this was economic migration. So they were not fighting from religious violence or religious persecution. They were fighting for coming for better life. So it was economic migration, and therefore the state had no responsibility to look after them. They were not even given the title of refugee. The Government of India coined the new term displaced person. So they were called DPs. So they were not recognized as legitimate partition refugee or partition migrant. And Nehru's policy initially was not rehabilitation but repatriation. That is, these refugees should go back. And therefore, he signed what is known as the Delhi Pact in April 1950. It is also known as the Nehru-Liaquat Ali Pact between India and Pakistan, whose main idea was to encourage all these refugees on both sides to go back to their homeland once again. But that did not happen. No one was willing to go back. I'll come to that later on, why they did not want to go back. Politically, it was opposed by Hindu Mahasabha and Jan Sangh, but ultimately, because of this political reason and also because of the reluctance of these refugees to go back on both sides, and in fact, where they actually went back, they found themselves in even worse situation. We have looked at the Calcutta situation, where some of the Muslim refugees came back, and when they came back, they found their homes were gone, their jobs were gone, they had nothing. So they had to go back again. And the same thing happened for some of the Hindu refugees who went to East Bengal. So by the time they went back, everything was gone. So this reverse migration did not really happen. It was only in a very small scale, and it created even more problem than it solved. So there was continuous migration throughout the 1950s. Now, the reason why many of these refugees did not want to go back was because of this very journey. We have also reconstructed the stories of this journey. This journey from their East Bengal villages, from where some of them, the flotillas of boats started at night, they came to the Golando station and then took the train. Each refugee was allowed only to take 50 rupees with them. Everything else was taken away from them at the border. And when they came on the other side of the border, there was the same kind of harassment by the Indian police and the Indian customs. And there was and when they could not find any way to take any of their property beyond 50 rupees, they started hiding, particularly gold ornaments and things like that. And when the police got to know that people were hiding their precious metals and other things, then started the whole story of body searches and so on. And where there was no discrimination, everyone was kind of subjected to same kind of harassment, and those who tried to flee, there are also cases where they were fired upon. In other words, this journey was so arduous that this created a rupture with the past. I mean, they did not really had the reverse journey. So that was the end of it. What was next for them? The next was that they came to the two stations, either Bengal or Darshana. These were the two border points from which they were coming in. From there, they were being taken to Sialda station. And at the Sialda station in Calcutta, where thousands, 5,000 to 6,000 people came every day, they were registered and categorized. I mean, yesterday on BBC, I was seeing how the refugees in Europe were being registered. I mean, the situation was far more worse in Sialda. What was happening? Everyone was coming. Their names were being registered and they were categorized. They were giving 3 colored cards. And the red colored cards was for those who did not require any help. The yellow colored cards were for those who required temporary help, and most of them qualified for a white card because they needed long-term support. And where the colonial, what we call colonial governmentality kind of worked when their names were registered, when someone told the name which was clearly a Namashudra name, immediately he was registered as a peasant needing long-term help. We interviewed someone who was a school teacher, and he protested vehemently that he was not a peasant, though he was a Namashudra, but the clerk just wouldn't bother. Since he was a Namashudra, he had to be a peasant. So in other words, they were now categorized, given 3 kinds of cards, and with the cards they would put into the train. And these trains, and the government of India knew, I mean, if you remember the stories of concentration camps, these from the train, from Sialda station, this train straight went into the camp. They were not allowed to get down from the train. Sometimes they were put in truck, and the trucks were not allowed to stop anywhere except inside the camps. And the government started about 40 camps. There was different types of camps, relief camps, transit camps, where local people, I mean, those who wanting temporary support, they were put in those camps. Then there were worksite camps where different kind of public works were undertaken. The refugees had to do the public, had to provide manual work in this public works, for which they got their doles and lived on the camps. And that's also another story. We interviewed a number of people who were not really peasant, and they were given job to cut a local pond, and they were not really ready for that kind of manual work. And also we have the records of really alarming rate of disease, and one we had a group interview of inmates of one camp. They said at the dead of night the truck would come and take away the dead bodies. There is no record, nothing. No one knew how many people died. So these were the camps which they were put in. We very closely looked at one particular camp, which is called the Cooper's Camp, because this was initially an American army barrack where people were put in. And as I was mentioning the concentration camp, this Cooper's Camp also, I don't have that photograph, also had a railway platform. This was near the Ranaghat railway station, but the refugee train would not go to the public railway station, would come directly into the refugee camp, which was fenced with barbed wire, and these refugees were offloaded in the camp. And when they were offloaded in the camp, they were given space within those long barrack-like rooms. And how much space they were given? The space they were given was 18 inch per person in width. That is this much, one hand, they would say one hand, which is roughly 18 inch per head in width and the length. And they would kind of demarcate their space with various things and would hang some saris and cloth for a little bit of privacy. Now, the other question we had, that in this kind of, and also the sanitation in the Cooper's Camp at the top of, when it was most crowded, it had about 70,000, it accommodated about 70,000 people, and it only had 100 toilets. So the sanitation level was appalling. These people were put in, they got their monthly dole, weekly dole, and some ration. and no privacy and little bit of space. Now, the question which we also had in this kind of situation, how can caste operate? Now, what is very significant that when these people were taken to the camps, they were allocated according to their caste status. And therefore, each of these camps had its own caste demography. For example, the Cooper's camp's residents were about 70 to 80% upper caste. I'm sorry, 70 to 80% Dalit, and about 20 to 25% upper caste. But that was the question. When they were allocated this kind of open space, if a Dalit and a Brahmin live together, how the caste system really operate? We interviewed people who were in charge of the refugee camp, the officials, and they would not admit that there was any caste distinction in allocation of space. But when we interviewed the actual inmates of these camps, they said that the upper caste were allocated separate rooms. So all these upper caste would be put into their own separate room, and the Dalit would be allocated into other rooms. So in other words, although at the state level there was no policy declaration about any of those earlier, the categorization of caste would be followed, but the local level of state bureaucracy, this whole thing, the categorization still worked. Now, what happened in these camps? Now, in these camps were fenced with barbed wire, and the refugees had no permission to go outside the camp and seek jobs, because the government was always fearing that they would run into competition with the local people. So they wanted these people to be separated from the local population. So what happened? So they could go out only when the government had offered them some rehabilitation package. And in some cases, 3 to 4 years, they had to wait until they they were offered some rehabilitation package, and I'll come to that later on. So for 3 to 4 years, these able-bodied peasants were put into the camp. They were not allowed to go out, and they just sat there. There was nothing. And we asked one of the inmates, what did you do the whole day? So we played cards. So they played cards endlessly. And obviously, when able-bodied peasants had nothing to do but to play cards, they start doing other things. And we'll come to the kind of resistance which kind of appears from this. But first, the policy. The government's policy at this stage, when they could not drive these people back to East Bengal, there was a major debate in the assembly. And the local government's position was that since they were peasants, they had to be rehabilitated in agricultural land, and there was no land in West Bengal. Whereas there were at least 2 alternative proposals which were submitted, one by the very senior statisticians and the other by Dalit themselves, that there were enough wasteland in West Bengal which could be reclaimed and where these refugees could easily be settled. But the major issue which comes out in the West Bengal assembly debates was the fear on the part of the established political groups about the competition and possible conflict between the migrant peasants and the resident peasants. So they just did not want to make them come into conflict or competition. And particularly many of the refugee leaders, particularly leftist refugee leaders, were also Kisan Sabha leaders. Where they had to look after the Kisan front. There was a very strong conflict of interest which was working in this whole debate. So ultimately the government came up with a rehabilitation plan, that is to take these refugees away from West Bengal. There were 2 arguments operating there. One was obviously the scarcity of agricultural land in West Bengal. The other argument was more political. The political argument was that this problem was not West Bengal's problem alone. So other provinces must share the responsibility of rehabilitating these people. So there was a conference of chief ministers from the neighboring provinces, and they agreed to take some of these refugees. And they were given subsidies by the central government. But they just took the subsidies, did nothing for these refugees. So when these refugees were sent to Bihar or Orissa, they just found themselves left in nowhere. There was practically no infrastructure, nothing, and they were just left in the open ground and allowed to fend for themselves. So all those who were sent to Bihar or Orissa or Assam, they again came back. So there was again a reverse migration. But when the reverse migration took place, when these people once again came to Howrah and Sialda station, the state obviously had no responsibility for them. So because they had once been given a rehabilitation, they did not take it, so that's it. So these people had nothing to do. I mean, they just squatted in Howrah stations and Sialda stations. So at this point of time, the government came up with the dispersal plan to send them to Andaman. That was in 1953, and then to Dandakaranya in 1957. Now, Andaman plan was being considered from the time of Lord Mountbatten. They were thinking of kind of clearing Andaman and rehabilitating Andaman. But it was around this time they found the labor power with which to settle the Andaman Islands. So the peasants, particularly those who could provide hard manual labor, were chosen from these refugee camps and sent to Andaman. But Andaman is a positive story. The sad story was sending of the people to Dandakaranya, which was a forest area in Madhya Pradesh, Orissa, Andhra Pradesh area, where it was completely forest and tribal areas, where among this tribal population and the forest population, this East Bengal refugees were sent with no infrastructural facilities or support. That. And also here, the rigid official categorization of occupations works. I mean, that's the whole categorization from the colonial period comes in, and this is quite I mean, you can see in the assembly debate where they argue they are Namashudras, they have to be peasants, so they have to be rehabilitated in agricultural land. There was, on one occasion, the minister, in fact, he was asked the question, can a Namashudra peasant aspire to become a teacher? And he simply, that he may, but we can't take responsibility for that. So they were kind of sent to the agricultural land. And then came this policy of forced dispersal, that the refugees were not given any choice whether to go there or not. If you do not accept, then you are left to yourself. At this point of time, this is Andaman, anyway, and this is the red area line, borderline area was the Dandakaranya. So at this point came the resistance from the camps. The refugees had accepted, had been suffering quite a lot, and at this point they objected and resisted the Dandakaranya scheme. The resistance first started from the camps. They formed the local Bastuhara Samiti in each camp. Bastuhara means the displaced people. And they were politically organized by the leftist groups. The United Central Refugee Council was mainly led by the communist leadership. And then the SBBS was Shara Bangla Bastuhara Samiti, led by Praja Socialist Party, which also had Jogen Mondol's leadership. By now, in 1950, Jogen Mondol has come back to West Bengal. And he organized the Satyagraha of 1950, April 1958. The Satyagraha was like this. Every day, thousands of refugees from all the refugee camps would come to Calcutta. And they would march to the Writers' Building. And at Writers' Building, they would be arrested. They won't be taken to a jail or police station. They would be driven by trucks 50 miles away and left there in the middle of nowhere. And they had to walk back to station. And this went on every day, and about 30,000 refugees were arrested in this whole movement. So when the Calcutta urban life had almost come to a standstill, B.C. Roy, the chief minister, came to a compromise. And the compromise was that no one would be sent to Dandakaranya unless they really wished to. So it would be a voluntary migration. But this was kind of reversed in 1959, and the records show it was mainly under the compulsion pressure from the government of India, that is from New Delhi, mainly from Morarji Desai, who was then the minister. So it was reversed, and reversing that's a forced rehabilitation decision was that if anyone did not want to go to Dandakaranya, then the state would not have any more responsibility to rehabilitate them. All the camps would be closed by 31st of July, 1959. And the government did not go back from this decision. So all the camps were closed in 1959. The closure of camps meant the complete withdrawal of state support for those who refused to go to Dandakaranya. And we now have several autobiographies written by the camp refugees, which kind of shows the misery and unrest among these refugees. I mean, the closing of the camps meaning the dole was closed, the ration was stopped, the schools were closed, and the dispensaries were closed, everything. The state just overnight withdrew its all support. And they have no way, no job, nothing to support themselves. So in this kind of situation, and we interviewed one person who said that when the camps were closed, we really felt to be refugees because everyone had refused us. So in other words, and what is also very significant, and this everyone also includes the mainstream political party, including the Congress and the CPI, because the election was coming. And both Congress and CPI began to see that the upper caste Bhadralok Bengali had accepted that the way to get rid of these Dalit peasant refugees was to send them to Dandakaranya. So if the political parties opposed the Dandakaranya scheme, they might lose the election. So it was better to kind of abandon the refugees to their fate. At this stage, what we also find, an autonomous Dalit refugee movement starts, which was mainly led by Jagan Mandal, who starts a satyagraha in 1959-61, the same kind of methodology, bringing camp refugees to the Calcutta, the city of Calcutta, kind of blocking and choking the city of Calcutta for days together. But then ultimately he withdrew the movement in October 61. This is another sad story because he found that in spite of that, without the help and intervention and mediation of the mainstream political parties, he could not carry on this autonomous movement. So he leaves this movement, withdraws this movement, and we have interviewed refugees who felt betrayed by this withdrawal. But Mandal's private paper kind of shows that he had no other option but to withdraw it because he was not getting any support from any mainstream political parties, and without that mediation, it was difficult for him to carry on. So very quickly, I think I've taken a lot of time, very quickly, the Hazratbal riot 1964 brought in fresh refugees from Khulna. And once again, when these refugees started coming, communal riots in Calcutta and border districts started. And once again, in these communal riots, a lot of Namshudra Dalit peasants were involved. And I categorically call these riots communal because of the very utterances. If you look at the police reports, which records which gives you the transcripts of some of the speeches delivered in villages and in the Namshudra areas by some of the leaders. These utterances, the speeches are very, very overtly kind of religious, and that has happened by 1964. But what is also very significant, at this stage, P.R. Thakur, who was with the Congress until now, who was even supporting the Dandakaranya scheme as opposed to Mandal, who was opposing Dandakaranya scheme, Thakur at this stage gave up Congress. He resigned from Congress, and immediately after that he was arrested by the West Bengal police. And both Mandal and Thakur, who were fighting on both sides of the political divide in 1946-47, met for the first time in the jail of independent India. Now, so by this stage, the two contending factions of the Dalit movement kind of converge, but the situation had changed such a way that their whole identity had completely changed. If you remember my first slide, I mean, the Namashudras and the Dalits were living in a very contiguous region. And that spatial cohesion gave them a very crucial power to mobilize for social and political protest. So those people were now scattered all over India. They had lost their spatial anchorage, and they were now spread. Some lived in Andaman, some lived in Madhya Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh, Orissa, and others. And where they did not and still do not enjoy the scheduled caste status, which give them access to the affirmative action policies. Because for each province, the scheduled caste are listed according to their history. So these people were not natives of those provinces, so not listed in the scheduled caste list, and therefore do not get any privilege under the reservation policy. So what do we mainly conclude? We conclude that the Dalit peasants, if we look at a long-term view of history, were neither uninvolved nor were accidental victims. But theirs is a long history of victimhood. Compared with the Bhadralok refugees, who were all well settled in Calcutta, in and around Calcutta, in the squatter towns by the mid-50s, their displacement still continues even today. Even today, their major movement is about their citizenship. And the other major impact of this long history of migration and displacement is their loss of physical space and the spatial capacity to mobilize. And they are so scattered throughout India today that they do not have that spatial capacity to mobilize. And their identity also went through a kind of transformation. As one of our interviews put it in a very succinct way, that when we came to this side of the border, we all became refugees. So when we came to India, we got a new identity. We became refugees. So in other words, under this broad rubric of refugee identity, their Dalit identity kind of got meshed up and disappeared, also particularly because of the very demography of the camps and the movement. Because throughout these movements, they had to kind of put in a joint front for the rehabilitation, and there was no scope for articulating their particular caste-focused deprivation or discrimination. And also the mainstream political parties, when they were intervening in their movement, they were also very, very particularly trying to suppress this whole caste idiom from this refugee movement. So in other words, their Dalit movement became kind of appropriated into the refugee rehabilitation movement. But we also argue that refugee is not a homogeneous category, because there is a very significant difference in experience of the first wave of refugees, that is the high caste Bhadralok refugees, who got a very good deal in rehabilitation, compared with these Dalit refugees who were simply left to fend for themselves and with very, very marginal state support. So we argue, although the experience of displacement might be similar, the experience of the stories of rehabilitation is remarkably different. So, and we've also come to the hypothesis that this story of dispersal and struggle for rehabilitation possibly also unsettled their politics of identity. And there is a big enigma and big political puzzle that political scientists and historians have often struggled with, why there is no strong scheduled caste movement in post-independence West Bengal. And we argue that this dispersal of Dalit population of Bengal was perhaps one of the reasons why it's not just there. These people do not anymore live in Bengal. So I will stop with that, and I'll love to have your questions and responses.